Okay, we're going to get started and people can join us as we go along. I'll quickly turn on my camera just so that I can greet you all properly. My name is Sue McKenna. I am in the Center for Postgraduate Studies here at Rhodes University. And it really is a great honor today to invite a guest speaker. Well, is he a guest? I'm not sure. Though many of you will know Fred from when he was Dean of Humanities here at Rhodes University, but he since then has taken up the role of executive member of the African Humanities Association. He's a mentor for the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. He's an editor of the African Humanities Book Series. So, like so many other academics that I know, this idea of retirement is clearly not very well understood at all, and it's really lucky for all of us that people continue to participate in these intellectual deliberations when there is no longer some sort of onus on them to do so to qualify for their salary. And that is something which is more than just a flippant comment. It's this idea that when we are within the academy in our various roles, that it is more than a job, that it comes with responsibilities. And amongst those responsibilities is what is often perceived only as a right and not as a responsibility, and that is this idea of academic freedom. And when I heard Fred present this paper, or an earlier version of this paper, at the Qadessia conference in Dar es Salaam in May, it really provoked a lot of thinking for me. And I, along with, I'm sure, some others, have been somewhat frustrated by higher education's inability, it would seem to me, to enact and take responsibility for many of its academic freedoms. And so I asked Fred if he wouldn't mind repeating his presentation. He's indicated that he's actually extended it a bit, and I am sure it will be just as useful and thought-provoking as the version that I heard in Tanzania in May. Thank you so much, Fred. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much to you, Sue, for inviting me. It's been a long time since I've done something like this at Rhodes, and I always enjoyed doing that. Although this time it's a kind of special mission, so to speak, because I've been really embarrassed by the silence on the part of Rhodes University as far as global conflicts are concerned. And so I use this particular debate that is current at the moment as a keyhole to explore bigger issues around academic freedom, but in particular for the university where I spent the bulk of my academic life. And so I'm still very much associated with Rhodes as an emeritus professor. And so what the university does matters to me very much. So if we could start with the first slide. So I started this by looking at three particular quotations, and I must thank Shiloh as well. So the first comes from the University of Uppsala. This is an inscription in the main auditorium of Uppsala University, and it says "Tänka fritt är stort, men tänka rätt är större." Basically, to think freely is great, but to think rightly is greater. Maybe we should go through each of the three kind of quotations, and then I'll speak to each of them. So the second quotation comes from Jawaharlal Nehru in 1947, and he says, "The university stands for humanism, for tolerance, for reason, for the adventure of ideas," a formulation that I particularly like, "and the search for truth. It stands for the onward march of the human race towards ever higher objectives. If the universities discharge their duties adequately, then it is well with the nation and the people." And then, of course, the inspiration for the title of this talk comes from a song by Jonas Gwangwa called Freedom for Some is Freedom for None. So the first two inscriptions represent vastly different views about the meaning of inquiry at a university. The first comes from the entrance to the Grand Auditorium in Uppsala University's main building in Sweden. It goes to the heart of the debate about academic freedom in the process of knowledge making, begging the question about who decides on what is right. In many ways, this question has been answered almost irrevocably in the contemporary United States of America, with many universities merely capitulating in the face of state aggression, and where what is right, for example, in how anti-Semitism ought to be defined, is nonchalantly captured by the state and enforced by major budgetary cuts to the apparently offending universities. The message is crystal clear. If you do not deal decisively with pro-Palestinian protests, we'll withhold your grants. The crass manner in which the powerful have monopolized what is right has called into question the very basis of a university. And this debate, I think, goes to the very heart of what a university ought to be. After decades of the global north preaching to us in the south about academic freedom, they've now given up that right with very little fight, very little opposition, and virtually no real belief in the true meaning of a university. To be fair, Harvard University has opposed Trump's attempts at state control through litigation, and who knows how long that legal process will take. But internally, at the university itself, there's also been a crackdown on Palestine scholarship. Some scholars have been demoted and some programs have been cancelled. But the clearest violation of academic freedom at Harvard in recent months, weeks really, is the withdrawal of an entire issue of the Harvard Education Review dedicated to education in Palestine. The issue was in an advanced stage of review. Contracts had already been signed by the contributing authors, only for the editors to be informed by the university high-ups that the issue could not be published. It is a staggering violation of academic freedom at Harvard University. While they're battling for institutional autonomy vis-a-vis Trump's attempts to control them, they are also sacrificing academic freedom. So that whole debate about how to think rightly is very much in vogue at the moment. The second inscription comes from Nehru's convocation address at the University of Allahabad, which is his birthplace. At first glance, its emphasis on tolerance and the freedom to explore, to seek knowledge and research as an adventure wherever it may take one, lies in sharp contrast to a notion of what is purportedly right. Yet towards the end of his speech, Nehru himself reverts to notions of doing what is right. And I'll come back to that later on. And as I mentioned, the third quotation is from the lyrics of a song by the legendary Jonas Gwangwa. While Gwangwa is not referring specifically to academic freedom, of course, the overall thrust of his message fits very squarely with the argument of this paper, that a segregated or bifurcated academic freedom is actually meaningless. So those three statements are kind of used as a springboard for discussing the notion of academic freedom in South Africa. Because all rights, like the right to academic freedom, don't occur in a vacuum. There's always a particular context which determines the parameters for the realization of rights. And in this paper, I highlight how conditions of inequality structure the possibilities for academic freedom in South Africa. But I'd like to start off with a debate which is very current in South Africa at the moment. It comes from, I wonder if you couldn't put the second slide. So this is the outline, current debate, and I'll, yeah, okay. This is the current debate. It comes from the Dean of Science at Wits, And he asks the question very pointedly and very provocatively: should our universities respond to geopolitical conflicts around the world? And referring specifically to the ongoing genocidal massacres in Palestine, his position calls for higher education institutions to be neutral. If we go over to the following slide, please. So this is the central point for Chetty. It comes from this paragraph. Universities releasing an official statement on the Israeli-Palestinian matter is not an academic freedom matter. That's how he starts off. Even though academic freedom is a right accorded to academics, a special group of individuals in society with important rights, responsibilities, and obligations, it is practiced on an individual basis. We practice academic freedom as independent, critical public voices. It goes against the principle of academic freedom for the university to impose a hegemonic view from the top on an essentially political matter when we have differing views on this amongst staff and students. Next slide, please. Continuing his arguments, it would be remiss of me, he says, to impose these views on the university through a vote, for example, when I fully know that there are differing and probably equally valid views on this. And we should avoid playing into the hands of extremists on both sides. So let me start off with where I agree with Chetty. And I agree with him on the next slide, where he says, showing but a cursory interest in the conflicts in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo now is a feeble attempt to retrofit our concerns there, when there's previously been no genuine interest at many of our universities. This comes across as being insensitive and insincere, and very much an afterthought. I agree with Chetty on this point, absolutely. But I think that we need to just reflect on it a little bit. You can, of course, concentrate on a particular issue. It's important not to isolate an issue, but you can concentrate on an issue in order to highlight the particular atrocities that are being committed, the particular way in which a genocide is being played out. But that doesn't mean that you can't also focus on other genocides. And Sudan is a particular case, as well as the DRC. As far as Sudan is concerned, I think the best reference in terms of trying to understand the enormously conflict situation in Sudan is books by Kwesi Pra. He has gone furthest in trying to understand Sudan, and I think it's incumbent on us as African academics, as African intellectuals, to pay as much attention to Sudan as we are paying to Palestine. But it doesn't mean that because so much attention has not been paid to Sudan, that we ought not to pay attention to Palestine as well. In other words, we shouldn't be paralyzed into doing nothing, into inertia, because of a seemingly overwhelming concentration on a genocide that's playing itself out in Palestine. If you just take one metric, in Sudan, currently more than 300,000 innocent civilians have been massacred. In the recent genocide in Palestine, in Gaza, slightly more than 60,000. So it's not the kind of metric that I like to put forward, but it does give you a certain indication as to the gravity of the situation in the Sudan, and we really do need to do much more about what is happening there. So that's where I agree with Chetty that much more can be done about Chetty, but I'm agreeing with him from a different standpoint. He's saying that we merely put in Sudan and the DRC just as a kind of add-on to our interest in Palestine. And I agree with him that it ought not to be like that, but he's saying that we shouldn't do it at all. Essentially, he's saying that we should not take any positions whatsoever. We should be neutral in the face of genocides and these conflicts at all. So where do I disagree with Chetty? If you could go over to the next slide. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly because it comes up in the substance of my paper, and I can see I'm not going to have a huge amount of time anyway. So neutrality in the face of all the evidence of genocide is obviously deeply problematic to me. And then he goes on to say that the views are equally valid. And the question that I'd like to pose to you is, can the views of the perpetrators of genocide and their supporters be equated with the views of the victims of those of the victims of genocide and those who support them? Sorry, I left out something there. This is not a war in Palestine, in Gaza. It's a genocidal massacre of unarmed civilians. Then the whole formulation around voting, which I find deeply problematic. Firstly, it's precisely when there are differing views that a matter should be voted on. The majority view then prevails. Chetty's statement undermines the very basis of democratic practice, and we understand that in South Africa very much. Basically, he says we should not vote because there are different views. And for me, this is a paralyzing position that merely serves to maintain the status quo. I just want to give one example of where a democratic process was followed. For example, around the name of Rhodes University, a number of years ago, there was quite a fractious debate about changing the name of Rhodes University. But through a process, it was agreed that the name ought to change, or ought to stay the same. And even though very many people do not like a university that is named after a war criminal and an arch imperialist and a racist, that is the name of this university, and it remains that way. So that's just an example of how a process can be followed, and it's a democratic process, and you accept the outcome. Hopefully in the future, there could be further processes that might lead to a change of the name. I also think that he misconstrues the issue in Palestine as a political issue. What's happening in Gaza at the moment is one of the greatest moral issues of our time. And for us not to take a position on it, for me, is just unconscionable. We simply have to do that because it again speaks to what a university ought to be doing. And what it ought to be doing, of course, is distilling the big ethical questions, the big moral questions of our time. And this is certainly one of them. It is incumbent on universities to be involved. The other problem that I have is that is highly individualized notion of academic freedom. And that, of course, is decontextualized from a context that we have of extreme inequality, both in our society and at higher education levels. And so the question I ask is, what is the role of the university if it doesn't respond? If we don't respond to these ongoing geopolitical global conflicts, or conflicts even in our background, where does that leave us? We can go through a very long discussion as to how at least humanities disciplines were actively involved, taking up positions, debating issues on how to propagate the struggle against apartheid. What has happened since 1994 is not only a demobilization of that vibrancy, but a sterility in the sense that the universities have become detached from the communities where they reside. So for me, the the answer to Chetty's question is yes, we should be respond to and be involved with and be engaged with what is happening in the world. If we do not do that, we risk being cut off from the creative roots of not only humanities disciplines, but all disciplines. If we could go to the next slide. So this is what prompted Chetty to ask the question. So 8 or 9 South African universities have issued statements on Palestine, and they are, and I just mentioned them there. I'm not going to go through all of that because it's just going to take me too much time. But each of them is quite different. I must say, just at the end there, Rhodes University is conspicuous by its absence, and as someone who is still associated with this university after very, very many years, I am embarrassed by this silence and by this absence. I think that we ought to be taking the lead around the moral questions of our time. So these statements, if you can go over to the next slide, the statements differ very vastly. They're not the same. Some universities have offered very bland statements about calling for a ceasefire in the conflict, while others have gone much further by imposing a prohibition on academic contact with specific universities in Israel, for example, those with links to the IDF. So it's important to understand that these are not just uniform statements. They're very, very, very different. If we could go over to the next slide, please. So what is our context, and what is this context that I'm speaking about all the time? We all know that South Africa is a deeply unequal country, and we also know that the inequalities, the class inequalities, still coincide very much with race in our country. Despite the democratic changes of 1994, in fact, many analyses are showing that the inequalities have deepened since 1994, despite the fact that we now have a growing black middle class. So in terms of the social structure, there are changes, but the inequalities remain entrenched and very, very durable since, well, it's 31 years now. And the inequalities are embedded in all aspects of South African society, and universities are no exception to this. By and large, with historically black campuses remaining at the bottom of the pile on a whole host of indicators, despite the gestures of institutional redress since 1994. And there are very many complex reasons for this enduring inequality in the university system, but it's clear to me that the higher education landscape has been profoundly shaped by the enduring legacies of apartheid. We simply have to take that context into account in trying to understand academic freedom. And if we go on to the next context, so these are things that have actually happened. So Gregory Kamwendo was the Dean of Humanities at the University of Zululand. He was killed in May 2018. He was a member of SAHUDA, the South African Humanities Deans Association, which is an organization that I was closely associated with from the very beginning. And he was killed for ensuring that that academic practice is maintained along certain principles, and he was killed certainly simply for doing that, for maintaining academic principles at a university where these principles were under attack by rogue elements, by criminals really, but embedded within the university, and that is what is so sad. Can we go over to the next slide, please? Context 3 is the killings at Fort Hare. So 3 people have been killed recently at Fort Hare: Victor Peter, Petrus Roots, and Bonelli Vesele. And this is what Sakele Buhlungu, who's the Vice-Chancellor at Fort Hare, says. We are battling them with ideas, with words. They're battling us with guns. And he further on says, we should move away from this homogenized idea that there's one definition of academic freedom for everyone. No, it means different things. It's shaped by our different histories. We at Fort Hare come from a particular history that has kind of killed the soul, the fiber of our institution since 1959. So 1959 was the year that the Extension of Universities Act was passed, making out of Fort Hare a Bantustan university effectively. And the roots of the violence and the killings and what you see on TV today, it originates from there. So let's be mindful and be open and open up this notion of academic freedom and autonomy, because they're different. They're different at Fort Hare and very different at how he delivered this speech, by the way, at the University of Cape Town. It was the T.B. Davey Academic Freedom Lecture that he gave at UCT about 3 years ago. 3 years, they're about 3, maybe 4. If we go over to the next slide, please. So the South African discourse on academic freedom, the way in which it's located very firmly within a legalistic framework of constitutionalism and rights, with virtually no reference at all to the abiding reality of extreme inequality in the higher education landscape and further afield. So I'm saying that it's a decontextualized discourse. Effectively, the discourse is around 2 main threats to academic freedom. On the one hand, there is a threat from within, and the threat from within is seen to be what is known as managerialism, the separation of the interests of the senior management at the university and from the professoriate down. And then the other is, so people who've been arguing along those lines that a huge threat to academic freedom is within the university, is people like Du Toit and Higgins. Then you have Jonathan Jansen, who's come up with the notion that the biggest threat to academic freedom in South Africa at the moment is the democratic state, following on from the apartheid state. And I'm just going to leave that out there. Of course, I differ quite profoundly with that notion. I say in a deeply divided environment, the virtues of academic freedom can only really be extolled properly if they take account of this context. There's no place for a segregated academic freedom. In many ways, I say that the discourse, the South African discourse on academic freedom, is a retrogression from the Kampala Declaration of more than 30 years ago. The Kampala Declaration argued for a much more engaged intelligentsia, and it speaks of intellectual freedom and not academic freedom, to incorporate notions of people who are writing, people of ideas outside of a university context. If you want to, I have the entire declaration online, and if you want to, I can highlight the particular clauses of the declaration that might be of interest here. But it's good to have a look at the Kampala Declaration for academic freedom. It follows the Dar es Salaam Declaration, which was before that. But if we can go on to the next slide, I'm going to try to. So I argue for engaged scholarship, and I think that it is necessary for us to be engaged. Across the continent, humanities, social sciences, and arts are under direct attack, both internally driven and externally imposed. The worst case of this comes from Uganda, where Museveni has decreed that humanities, social sciences, and arts graduates will not be employed in any state agency. Himself being a humanities graduate didn't really bother him, and a radical leftist from the University of Dar es Salaam at that. And so the only way in which we can address this attack, this derision, because that is what it is in the end, is to be organized. And I'm trying very hard for that organization to happen through the African Humanities Association. And the African Humanities Association, if I can just put a small plug in for it, has a very broad definition of the humanities, incorporating social sciences and arts, as well as the traditional humanities disciplines. We need to have an understanding of the connections between institutional autonomy and academic freedom, but I don't want to go into that in much detail, just to say very briefly that institutional autonomy, by and large, relates to how a university can be autonomous in relation to state intervention or possibilities of state intervention. We know, of course, that across the continent, institutional autonomy is not a value that is very widely held, and it's felt in all kinds of ways. Virtually all the vice chancellors are appointed by the president, and the president usually makes himself, almost invariably himself, the chancellor of the university. So completely intertwined with the state. Thandika Mkandawire argued very forcibly that the problems that we're experiencing in development, in particular across the continent, is because of the bad relations that exist between political elites and intellectuals. And he says that only, as far as his research has shown, only in Algeria and in apartheid South Africa did a symbiotic relationship exist between political elites and intellectuals. And he's arguing that political elites almost invariably see the universities as hotbeds of resistance and as opposing them. And there's been an ongoing, I suppose, battlefield that universities engage with in engaging with the state. I just want to quote from the Nelson Mandela University Council statement on Gaza. This is what they say. As a university, we are aware of our responsibility in contributing to solve problems that affect the world and to educate, to liberate human potential. And just to end off, if I may, just to go to the last slide, these quotations are, I think, particularly pertinent for us. So the first one comes from, if you can just move over to the next slide, comes from Desmond Tutu when he says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. And the same thing could be said about the Palestinians, the people of Gaza, who are clearly the mice, as opposed to the elephant, which has a foot not only on their tail, but on the entire being. And then finally, a very famous quotation from Nelson Mandela. We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians, without the resolution of conflicts in East Timor, the Sudan, and other parts of the world. I'm very pleased that he added resolution of conflicts in East Timor and the Sudan as well. And this was in 1997. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Fred, for taking us around step by step, a very complex and very important argument. And certainly as speaking as someone who is currently a member of Rhodes University, this conversation is one that we really need to be having so much more explicitly. What on earth is a university for? If we are under the impression that it can be a neutral social structure, I think we are clearly fooling ourselves. Let us open. We've got a bit of time for questions, and we are looking forward to hearing from all of you. So if you would like to, if you are able to find the tool at the bottom under the React button, I think it is, you can put up your hand. Otherwise, I'll keep an eye. You can just unmute yourself. Otherwise, you can put your questions into the chat bar. So let's engage with Fred and what he has had to offer us today. If you're battling to find the button to put up your hand, I'm going to just just ask you to just unmute yourself, and I'll notice that you've unmuted yourself and call out your name. But in the meantime, someone who has managed to find the icon to put up her hand is Joy Joseph. Over to you, Joy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Prof Fred. Good afternoon, Sue. It's
Hello,
nice
hello,
to be
Joy.
on this platform.
Hello, Joy.
Thank you to everyone who groomed us as doctors. I want to especially acknowledge the presence of my PhD supervisor, Professor Patrice Kabeya-Wepu. Thank you so much. Fred, I am a bit worried. I would like you to explain what you mean by engaged scholarship, the necessity for engaged scholarship, because I'm worried that in academia, especially for some of us who are trained here, if you're involved in this kind of research, maybe I'm not doing the right thing. That's why I'm asking. Two things happened to that fellow. The person is either stigmatized, you would not find a space in any university, or even when you get a space, you may get kicked out or whatever happens. It's so sad to see a dean killed because he wants to uphold the tenets of what it is to be an academic. So my question is, what is an engaged scholarship? What is this necessity for engaged scholarship? How do you manage this engaged scholarship that your head is not giving out? There's just one life. There's no photocopy. So you want to be careful. You want to survive the terrain. You don't want to be like Joy Joseph, who speaks a lot of grammar, a lot of French, a lot of languages, and you are just there. So you're worried, you want to back out. And I remembered when we graduated from Rhodes, that was the first thing that was said during graduation. You are supposed to be an agent of positive change, an agent of social justice. No, you will not survive academia. I'm not sure, maybe I'm not doing the right thing, and I'm not ashamed to present myself so that I could get the necessary help. What is an engaged scholarship? How do you navigate your space to survive the academic terrain without getting the head cut off? Thank you so much, Fred.
Okay, Sue, do you want me to respond immediately, or do you take a few questions?
Feel free to respond immediately. If anyone else has a question, please put up your hand or pop it in the chat bar.
So, Joy, thank you for that question. It's an important question. I think that if you're experiencing that level of repression at an academic institution, that you expect your head to be cut off, then that is even more reason to be organized, to participate in struggles, to ensure that that your research is tied up with ways in which people are struggling to meet their own challenges, instead of cutting yourself off from those struggles to such a degree that your own work becomes completely sterile and in fact becomes what are the creative roots for humanities scholars? The creative roots for humanities scholars lie in communities and the struggles that they experience, that they're going through, and the challenges that they're experiencing. And so, in order for your work, in order for your research to have currency, it simply has to be engaged with those challenges and with those struggles, whether those struggles are in language, whether those struggles are in art, whether those struggles are in trying to make a living. It doesn't matter what those struggles are. But to simply say, I can't be an engaged scholar because my head may be cut off. It's a very sad thing that you can even say something like that. It would be much, you have agency in whatever position you're in. Everybody who is human has agency. In some circumstances, your agency may be circumscribed. In some certain circumstances, you may not be able to do very much. But there's always something that you can do. I just want to give you one example of this because I thought it was such a fantastic example. So Pep Guardiola, the Manchester City coach, was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Manchester. And in his speech, he referenced what was happening, the genocide in Gaza. And the example that he gave was the example of a bird who was carrying a little bit of water to try to put out a fire. And everybody was asking him, but what are you trying to do? You're taking a little bit of water to try and put out a blaze. And the bird simply said, I'm doing my bit. And Pep Guardiola did his bit in his speech at Manchester University by speaking about his own children and comparing his own children to the children that are being killed in Gaza. Not only are they being killed, they are being targeted in Gaza. And so you have a particular pernicious kind of environment that you have to respond to. There's no other way to deal with it.
Thank you so much, Fred. Yeah, and I think that message, if we hear nothing, if we heard nothing of what Fred said today, let us hear that we have to make connections. We have to use our agency to speak out where we can, but forge solidarities, work together. Reynaldo, over to you.
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the US. Dr. Hendricks, great to see you again, my friend. So I have two questions. The first one is in relation to the university as an institution. I'd like to hear your thoughts as to how you see the failure of institutions taking a stance on this in relation to the bankruptcy of Western liberalism writ large. And then the second question is more operational, and that's what kind of transcontinental institutional academic collaborations do you propose or foresee that can actually challenge this modus operandi? Thank you.
Okay. Can you look at, I obviously have a sense of the bankruptcy of the liberal world, but there'll be a whole range of different ways in which that could be concretized. And if you could be more concrete in your question about it, because universities are also inherently hierarchical institutions and also in many ways elite institutions. A small proportion of the population manages to enter university. And so then the big question becomes how the population at university, how it decides on the nature of its relation with the outside world, the so-called town and gown, how the gown meets the town, so to speak. What kind of relationships, what are the modalities of the connections between academics and the outside world? And that can be very carefully worked out. It doesn't need to be, there can't be a kind of blueprint about it. But I do see that those connections with the outside world should be both with civil society and with the state. In other words, it can't just be with civil society, so to speak, because in a world where there is such a huge amount of disinformation, and where disinformation is orchestrated, where you have this fake news that floods virtually every form of media, there is a real role for university, especially if university sticks to its mission of being a place where truth is sought, as Nehru said very, very eloquently, but where others have also said the same thing. So there's a very real role for universities to play in that situation. I mean, if I think about the United States, I think of the most recent Kennedy withdrawal of funding around health issues. So the entire health notions around vaccines, even though he makes a statement saying that he is in favor of science and that he will be choosing the best scientists, what he does, in fact, is to withdraw the funding, which can have devastating health consequences across the globe if vaccines are not developed in order to fight the viruses that we know are with us. So a broad issue about the liberal world and where we are. I'm not entirely sure whether the liberal world is also living up to its own precepts of being liberal. If you look at the way in which the Western world has turned as basically complicit in the genocide. If you think of the new chancellor in Germany, when he just came in, he mentioned that Netanyahu was welcome to visit Germany, even though there's a warrant of arrest for Netanyahu. But he says, no, he's welcome to come to Germany. He has now started to change his stance, but that was his initial, because the genocide is so public, it's so much in view. It's on your screens. It's being live streamed. It's a genocide that's being seen as it unfolds. So it's not like what happened in Rwanda in 1994, where it happened and then people started commenting on it. We're seeing the genocide unfold in real time, and that is a particular makes it particularly in your face, but at the same time also allows people to be almost inured to the levels of suffering and the atrocities that are being committed. In terms of the continental response, I'm involved with the African Humanities Association, but I've also been involved with Codestria, Codestria is the biggest social science association on the continent, and it has done an enormous amount in mobilizing scholars around a variety of issues, and academic freedom has been one of the issues they've taken up they've been taking up almost since they started more than 50 years ago, 52 years ago this year. And they've been doing that consistently.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fred. And I just want to add something, if you don't mind, and that is that it's so important the way in which the humanities and the broader social sciences are driving many of these conversations, but we don't. Nobody in this room who happens to come from, I don't know, commerce, well, that's social science, I guess, engineering, physics, chemistry, whatever. Of course, if we understand the university to be a common good, and if we take the white paper of 1997's instruction to all of us to nurture critical citizenry, then this conversation we're having today really is the business of all of us, regardless of what discipline we're in. And as Fred said, another key role for universities is therefore to help our students engage in a world in which seeing is not always believing, and there's so much misinformation out there. This should be vital to every curriculum. There's an anonymous question that I'd like to ask. I'd like to ask you, and it says, with funding being such a scarce resource, and a number of international funders beholden to the Israeli agenda, how do we encourage our own academics to put what is right first?
So I don't know whether you've been following what's been happening at University of Cape Town. So the University of Cape Town passed, the Senate and Council passed a very progressive statement on Gaza, and they indicating a boycott of Israeli academic institutions, and at the same time also assisting in building the demolished, there's no other way of putting it, demolished higher education sector in Gaza, because the universities have been destroyed, have been flattened. So to speak about academic freedom when your university doesn't exist any longer. And Forte, by the way, has also been at the forefront of that. But they've lost huge amounts of funding as a result of this. But I say, and there was an article in, I think it was in the Daily Maverick by somebody the name of Kevin Bloom, who gave us a very good account of how much funding was being cut at UCT as a result of sticking their guns in passing the resolutions. At the moment, one of the professors at UCT has taken the university to court to try to rescind these resolutions. So that is where, and I believe it's going to be heard sometime in October. Affidavits have been drawn up on both sides, and we'll see what happens with that process. But a university such as UCT, which doesn't have a particularly great record as far as academic freedom is concerned. If you think about the Archie Mafeji affair in particular, in 1968, he was given the job of senior lecturer, and then the then apartheid Minister of Education spoke to the Vice Chancellor at the time, and they rescinded the offer of employment to Mafeji. So the letter of appointment was written already for him, because it had gone through all their processes, and because it was a black academic at UCT at the time, 1968. It wasn't against the law to employ black academics, but the letter was written, but and in those days they didn't have HR. The registrar wrote the letter. But the letter was never sent. It was intervened by the Vice Chancellor, who at that point was very definitely acting against the council decision, because once the council makes a decision, the decision ought to be implemented. But because of the intervention of an apartheid minister, he persuaded council at a special meeting, I think they called, to withdraw that application. So that is not withdraw the application, withdraw the offer of appointment. They are losing millions in research funding. But I have to say that you either have to stand on a principle, or you have to go with expediency. And if you go with expediency, then your entire being is compromised by that expediency. You don't have any principles then. Your only principle is to get money. And unfortunately, universities have become so marketized that that has become a kind of an overarching moray almost at universities. But I say that you have to look for alternative funding. Fortunately, in the humanities, you don't need a huge amount of funding. The people that have really been affected by cuts in funding like this, because of the position taken on Gaza, are natural scientists, and especially in the health sector. They're the ones that have been most severely affected by the cuts in funding.
Thanks, Fred. Liesel, I see you've made a couple of interesting comments. I wonder if you would like to unmute yourself and especially this comment about being afraid to offend. Liesel William.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you so much for a thought-provoking lecture this afternoon.
Hello, Lisa.
Sorry, I've had to go onto my phone, so I'm not able to switch on the camera at this stage. But I often question, where do people's affiliations lie? Because you find researchers that would openly deny any wrongdoing with affiliating research alignments and having their alliances lie with certain countries that are also at war with each other and are also fighting huge battles, genocides, mass killings, etc. Yet, again, to me, it looks like money speaks at this stage. Where does the truth lie? And are we academics or are we researchers? You've answered the question, Prof. You've said, you've got to take a stance. You've got to have your moral voice and your moral stance and your voice needs to come through in your research. We are there for knowledge creation, not for hiding behind funding and perpetuating non-truths from a moral stance.
Thanks for that, Liesel. I think the comment speaks for itself.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone else before we wrap up? Is there anyone else with a question or a comment? It doesn't need to be a question. You might just want to add something to it. Nkosinathi, I see you are unmuted. Would you like to say something? And then I've got Sipakazi after that.
Thank you. A very good afternoon, colleagues and Professor Hendricks, and thank you for the thought-provoking presentation. And it seems something of a challenge to everybody, because it seems to me that academic freedom has always been conditional with challenges of government regulations, political pressures, and funding dependencies encroaching on university autonomy. And somehow I'm thinking, what is the way to break out of that in order for academic freedom to prevail?
I'm not sure I'm following you, Nkosinathi. I think you just lost me there, but
What can we do, I think, is the question. What is within our role? You've spoken very strongly about using what agency we have. You've spoken about the need for solidarity. What can be done in our little spaces?
Well, as a start, the university can issue a statement in support of the victims of genocide in Gaza and in the Sudan. As a start, I think that could happen. What Fort Hare is doing is very interesting. There are many things that can be done. I don't know if you've been following, but the Vice Chancellor, as well as the then chair of the Council of Fort Hare, went to Qatar for a meeting with universities from Gaza, together with some Scottish universities as well, and they were trying to talk about how, even given the dire situation that pertains in Gaza, how you can try to get something going, to rebuild university life, to ensure that there's some kind of intellectual life that's been destroyed up to, and the destruction is ongoing. It's not as if it's stopped. It's still going on. And I agree very much with Liesel when she says, when funding shapes research, is it still scholarship? If funding does shape research, then it basically becomes a consultancy. It doesn't become independent research. It becomes a consultancy where you are entirely beholden to the funder. And invariably, under those conditions, you don't want to be a part of that kind of dependent relationship. Well, I don't want to personally.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fred. As I said in the introduction, Fred was the Dean of Humanities for many years at Rhodes University. And so now I want to hand over the mic to Sipakazi Makhatla, who is the incoming Dean of Humanities. I think she will begin. She's at STIAS at the moment, working on a book, and I think she begins her deanship in January, if I'm not mistaken. Over to you, Sipakazi.
Thank you so much for that, Sue. Thank you for the talk, Fred. It's really wonderful to listen to you. And perhaps it's really a comment, just to talk about how saddening is the kind of silence, even the absence of debate at our university. You may recall in 2014, we had a vigil for Palestinian children that were killed. There were these little graves in front of the main building. It was such a moving display of solidarity.
With candles.
With candles, exactly.
Yeah, really.
And
no, I remember it very well.
Yes, and we used to have one of what I thought of as the most robust Israeli apartheid week conversations at Rhodes. And what it did for a young person coming into the university was to say, it is okay if you didn't know much about this topic, but actually it's important for you to want to know more. Because you have a stake in the debate, to have a point of view. And so I must say, I mourn the disappearance of that, and sort of trying to think of ways just to have the conversation, because sometimes I think the young people, once the young people take up the issue as important to them, it has a way of shaping the debates at Senate, at Council, and elsewhere, So maybe if you have some ideas of how we might do that. But I'm also interested if you are also linking the kinds of silence we are seeing even from the young people with a broader crisis of values in South Africa. I say this because it was so interesting last year when the SRC at Rhodes had its leadership week, and their opening speaker was Julius Malema. It's fine for them to invite Julius, but this was just weeks after that VBS statement was what is made public, where Malema and others were being accused of stealing millions from this bank where many Black people, many people's grandparents had saved their money. And I said to students, you must go and engage with Julius, listen to what he has to say about leadership, but also ask him about the 16 million that he is being accused of taking from this bank. Of course, none of the students did that. It was absolutely packed. But none of them had the courage to ask him, because they said to me that we fear what he might say. He might embarrass us. And I said, what does it mean for you to invite a leader who might humiliate you? This person was opening up this leadership week. And so when you have at a local level that kind of fear, where millions have disappeared, where the livelihoods of grandparents have been destroyed, and young people don't have the courage to confront that, it seems to me that they won't have the courage to confront the images of bodies of Palestinian children dying, in Gaza. I don't know how, I'd like to have a sense of how you are making some of those links, because that same week, we had a whole conversation about the report that was released last year on matters of sexual harm and gender-based violence at universities, a report that hadn't been released for years. Again, our students' leadership had no interest. Saying what? I said to them, does this mean that there's no gender-based violence happening in your university? Of course there is. And so to me, whether it is Gaza, whether it is femicide in the university context, whether it's corruption, all of it is connected. And I would like you to perhaps say something about that and the ways in which we can have these conversations with young people. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we perhaps have missed a boat around is the question of community engagement at universities. And because it's been seen as something kind of apart from us and it kind of happens there, but there hasn't been an engagement with what it really means. And one of the things, I agree with you very much with what you're talking about, the broader crisis of values in our society as a whole. That is something that has bothered me very, very, very much. In the Western Cape, we regularly have attacks on ambulances and usually, and the people that you may have a young person in the ambulance that dies as a result of an attack on an ambulance, or an attack on a fireman. People who are coming to put out a fire are attacked. There is a very definite kind of crisis in values, crisis in morality that goes very deep in us. And I'm not too sure how to counter that, because it's not going to be countered. In the Western Cape also we have a kind of a counterculture of gangs, which has an entirely kind of inverted value system, so to speak. That if you commit the perfect murder, then you will move up the ranks in a gang. So yeah, that it's a deep problem. But I think one of the things that in Makanda in particular, GADRA is doing some sterling work. There are some green shoots, and we have to try and nurture those as much as we can. When I was dean, I tried to start a committee of deans of humanities with principals of the high schools in Makanda, Grahamstown at the time, because at that time there was only a handful of students coming from the township schools to Rhodes. It's a different environment now at Rhodes. The student demographics has changed completely, but I still think that there's a huge amount can be done in working through schools in a place because you've got such fantastic schools in Makanda. I mean, globally recognized private schools and some really, really, really good state schools as well. So to work through schools, but then on campus, we have to try to. You have to try and, I'm speaking now as somebody who's very old, but somebody who recognizes that the only way in which you can get across to students is to be close to them. When I started lecturing, my friends were students, because when I started lecturing at Rhodes University, there were very few black lecturers at Rhodes. So the overwhelming majority of my friends were students. And so, but because I was young at the time, I listened to the same music as they were listening to. We went to the same pubs. But you were involved with the students. As you get older, it becomes more and more difficult to know what makes young people tick. And you'll be deluding yourself if you think you can do it. So, but there's a necessity for doing that, for tapping into where young people are, and then using that as a springboard for unlocking the potential that they have, which they of course have. I don't know whether the extent of individualization has reached a point where any kind of communal exercise or practice or getting together, except of course if it's in a very circumscribed kind of way, whether there are possibilities for it any longer. I'm not sure about that. Whether the extent of atomization of our students has reached a level where it's very difficult for the solidarity that we talk about to emerge. But that you can only know that once the attempt has been made to foster those links, those solidarity links. And the one other thing that we are trying in AHA, in the African Humanities Association, is linkages between older academics and younger scholars. We know that we can learn a huge amount from younger scholars. And not only as far as music is concerned, we can learn a huge amount from them. And I believe that we have something to offer them as well. And so it's something that we're trying to foster, mentoring linkages between older academics and younger scholars. So there are many different things, you know. The challenges that we're facing continentally are so huge that anything that you do will have a kind of ripple effect. And I'm seeing it happen, I have to say, in the humanities, faculties across the continent where we've had some impact, some role, especially in Nigeria, which is, I mean, if you make an impact in Nigeria, you're making an impact in a huge swathe of the continent anyway. And you can see that our academics are addressing Senate with much more confidence. They're becoming much more assertive. They're becoming vice chancellors. I mean, the first woman vice chancellor at the University of Ghana, which is a huge university of over 60,000 students, is a woman, and she is one of our mentees. I'm very proud of that, I have to say. So yeah, there's always something that you can do, especially given the depth of the problems that we face, and also given the widespread depravity that exists, not only in our society but globally, you know.
Thank you so much, Fred. I just want to give an opportunity to go back to Ronaldo because he'd like to. Oh, and sorry, I see Karina is here. Karina, you had your hand unmuted for a brief while as well. So perhaps I should let you speak first. Karina, do you want to ask your question? You are muted, Karina. In the meantime,
And so I'm struggling to raise my hand.
okay.
Maybe you will recognize me later. Yes.
Patrice, yes, of course I will. Okay, well, Karina's battling to unmute herself, so I'm going to quickly give an opportunity to Reynaldo, who wants to reframe his question. I don't think we completely engaged with it as he'd like us to. Reynaldo, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So, Fred, my questions, but the second question I phrased, I'm very curious to hear what are your thoughts on what kind of transcontinental academic institutional collaborations you can foresee that would challenge, challenge what's going on. More specifically, as you know, I'm at Howard University, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what are some of the academic responses uh, um, across institutions from different continents that can speak to this, given the way you have characterized the challenge or perhaps crisis with higher education?
So there has been a lot of interaction with the diaspora that has happened, the African diaspora. But I think that what you're talking about is perhaps at a broader level, what kind of solidarity arrangements could be promoted between universities and not only individuals in the diaspora. Is that what you're saying?
A combination of both, meaning the top level institutional, but then also equally in terms of knowledge production, the kind of academic research that our graduate students can engage, in collaboration with graduate students on the continent, or even more so in terms of the classes that the undergraduate classes that can be offered in terms of instruction.
Well, look, I'm speaking now from the position of the African Humanities Association. We've not done a huge amount about that. In fact, we have been concentrating so much on the continent per se, and in trying to establish the association as fully fledged and fully representative across the continent, that we've not yet made any inroads into the island nations, which is our next kind of challenge, I suppose, our next frontier, so to speak, if you want to use a word like that. But we've not engaged in that kind of I think we have very good relations with the American Council of Learned Societies. As you may know, the African Humanities Association grew out of the African Humanities program, which was a US-based program coming from the American Council of Learned Societies. So those relationships are still quite strong. We have a memorandum of agreement on cooperation and so on. And I have to say, I've been very impressed with the way in which the ACLS has taken up a stance against Donald Trump. So for those who don't know, the ACLS is it's a professional body of professional bodies in the humanities across the US. And it's existed for more than 100 years. It's over a century old. So it's quite a powerful body in the sense that it's representing so many different professional disciplines in the humanities. And they've taken up a very strong stance against the incursions, the interventions that Donald Trump has attempted, and in many cases succeeded because of the capitulation of, for example, Columbia University. But yeah, it is something that we can work together on in building those cross-continental linkages. I would imagine that it would also be it's kind of incumbent on us to seek cooperation with academics in the global South more broadly. But I wouldn't rule out cooperation with academics in the US or in Canada or in Europe or in Britain for that matter. I don't think that it should be ruled out at all.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the more solidarity and connections we can find, the stronger our voices become. Karina, can I ask you to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Am I audible now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Finally. Good afternoon, everybody, especially Prof Hendricks.
Hello.
I have a big network problem. So much that I was only hearing snippets. of all the dialogue across from you up to the latest was Reynaldo. Before him was Professor Matata. I was only hearing, I think the projection was very poor technologically. I think maybe the problem is with my phone. I kept going out and going in, going out and going in. But from the little that I heard, I think that, Prof, you are querying the way the freedom of the academics is compromised. And I'm part of that because I'm also in the humanities. But I heard what Prof Magatla said when she was defending Rhodes, saying that there's something that they did. But even that, I was hearing here and there. I think that maybe since this dialogue, this lecture, public lecture is recorded, maybe I can get it from the post part of it. Thank you for now, because I was not really involved, and I lament that. I'm sorry. I think it's my device.
No
that
problem,
caused this.
Karina. We are indeed recording it and we'll send it out to everyone who registered because I know a few other people weren't able to join us. So please don't worry, you will be receiving the recording. Thanks for that. I'm going to jump now to Patrice.
Thank you very much, Sue. And thank you very much, Fred, for making your time to come and talk to us. Really, the issue related to Palestine, it is a big issue. And I think for Rhodes University, it is even bigger because we have a student. It's not important to talk about one person, but because it is a genocide, we have so many people dying every day. But in the middle of that, we have a student, a PhD student, who is registered at Rhodes University, but who is there with the entire family and suffering a lot. We have tried with the international office to show movies related to Gaza and what is happening there, and to bring forward testimonies from our student who happened to be there and the interviews that he gave in relation to the situation in general, which is a very big one. And I'm happy that you have spoken about neutrality. It is not a good thing in our world as academic to entertain such thing as neutrality. It doesn't exist at all, but what we can see there is that it could be a wrong choice that people are making, considering the financial benefit that they are gaining from different bodies that are working with perpetrators of genocide. And I have to thank you for that. And what I can say is that although all the universities in South Africa might not have made a statement, it is important that for even those who have made a statement, we shouldn't limit ourselves only to the statement, but we have to have some strategies to go beyond that. I'm saying this because of two experiences that I had, one last year and one this year. Last year, I was in Morocco and traveling from Casablanca to Rabat. But the person I spoke to, I engaged with a person who was from Morocco, and that person, learning that I was coming from South Africa, the person was like thankful to say, you people there, you are really active when it comes to Palestine cause. I can see your government bringing Israel to court in relation to this matter. And then we could exchange with that person. I was happy. That's why I'm saying that even though not everyone is participating, but those who are participating, we need to continue participating with them to imagine even new strategies to bring result. I can say that I was lectured maybe 2 weeks ago in Cape Town. Someone took me in a Uber, but started talking to me about this issue. I could see this was an ordinary person, but that person was really knowledgeable. And that person was really having all the feet on the ground to say, no, we have to do something. But if that can be said, why can't we do? This is why I'm saying what we need to do now is more than the statement that we make, but we have to imagine strategies that will bring really good result. Like you are suggesting, yes, we can go through those international bodies. If they are powerful, that is good, but we need to try them first. I think it is more than the statement that we do, because otherwise we could just be there and some people will just say, we have made a statement, this is our position. But that does not matter for now, because even our government, we can't force the government to take action because we see that the government is already taking action, which is very good in South Africa. This is the comment I have to make. And I thank you very much, Fred, for talking to this issue to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a comment. And one of the things that I really want to underline that Patrice said is about us finding various spaces for these conversations. Having a statement at Senate is so significant and so important. But with or without that, there's so much more that all of us can be doing in whatever way. As Fred said, you know, we might just be feeding a few drops to a bird, but it hopefully can collectively make a difference. I think it is now time for me to call this session to a close. I will indeed send out the recording, or the lovely Shiloh who manages these sessions will send out the recording to everyone who registered. And just an enormous thank you, Fred, for sharing your thoughts on this matter and for provoking us to be a little bit more active. And yeah, I think someone said in the comments, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. So we really need to think very carefully, what is it that we stand for as universities and as individuals? Thank you, Fred.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you for inviting me, Sue.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Thanks, Patrice. Thanks, Patrice. Bye-bye.